The night of May 8, 1943, fell moonless over the Solomon Islands, a thick cloak of ink that swallowed the silhouettes of volcanic mountains, the crowns of coconut palms, and the treacherous reefs that rose like bones at low tide. In Blackett Strait, a claustrophobic corridor between Kolombangara Island and the chain of islands to the south, the water seemed still, dark, and, for the Imperial Japanese Navy, safe. There, the Tokyo Express operated with the confidence of a sacred ritual, a nocturnal procession that was the umbilical cord for its army in the South Pacific. Long-hulled, sharp-prowed Japanese destroyers, symbols of the empire's naval engineering, glided in near-arrogant silence. On board, the atmosphere was one of routine. Lookouts scanned the darkness more out of habit than fear, while their ships, designed for speed and the decisive battle, the Kantai Kessen, the doctrine that promised a glorious victory in a single grand naval confrontation, carried men, ammunition, and rice to isolated garrisons. Their commanders, trained in the most rigid traditions of the Imperial Navy, saw the ocean as a stage for honor. In that tight geography, what they did not know was that the stage had already been set for a different kind of spectacle, a script written by the enemy with mathematics and steel. The trap had been laid days earlier, in a bold operation under Admiral Halsey's orders. 3 American mine-laying destroyers, the USS Gamble, USS Breeze, and USS Preble, had slipped through the strait, sowing the waters with more than 250 Mark VI naval mines. They were patient weapons, designed with antennas that would detonate at the mere contact with a steel hull. They floated, silent and invisible, waiting. And that night, the wait ended. Without warning, the sea exploded. A blinding white flash, then another, and a third. Columns of water, fire, and shrapnel rose like liquid volcanoes, tearing through the night's silence. What had seemed a familiar passage revealed the invisible teeth of the minefield. Confusion aboard the Japanese ships was total. The destroyer Kuroshio struck full on, had its backbone snapped, and sank almost instantly, taking 83 men with it. The Oyashio and the Kagero, maneuvering in the chaos, hit other mines. Immobilized and ablaze, they became easy targets for the air attacks that would come with dawn. The message of that night was etched into the coral bottom. In this war of islands and straits, brute force was no longer the only law. Speed, surprise, and cheap engineering could defeat armor and outdated doctrines. The reports that reached Rabaul and Tokyo, transmitted by radio amid static and panic, tasted of iron and disbelief. Stunned crews described an enchanted sea, an ambush by the ocean itself. There was no enemy battleship squadron, no dive bombers screaming with sirens. There was only the cold, impersonal brutality of engineering. Blackett Strait was not just water, it was a funnel, an inevitable geographic bottleneck for anyone wanting to supply troops on Kolombangara. It was the perfect place for asymmetric warfare, where inches mattered more than tons, and a few degrees of error in course separated an intact ship from a steel tomb on the seabed. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Japanese captains who had once navigated the throat with near contemptuous confidence now crossed it with hearts in their throats, engines primed for evasive maneuvers, lookouts straining their eyes in the absolute blackness for an enemy they could not see. What no one at the operations table could yet admit was the uncomfortable premise beginning to form. From that night on, the mighty were no longer safe. The sea, once a realm of honor and power, was now infested with traps, shadows, and echoes. And in the wake of those flashes would come a type of predator that the Imperial Japanese Navy, in its fixation on the decisive battle, had not foreseen. They were small, insolent, and fast as blasphemy. With disdain, Japanese officers nicknamed them mosquitoes, irritating, fragile, and easily crushed. They did not realize that in the darkness of those islands, the mosquitoes were evolving, learning to hunt. Arrogance blinded them to the truth emerging. In a war of logistics, Whoever controls the supply routes controls destiny. And these mosquitoes did not come to fight Japan's war. They came to cut the empire's veins, turning every crossing into an exercise in fear. The era of invisible warfare had begun. In American shipyards, far from the stifling heat and humidity of the Solomons, the war was fought with drafting tables, saws, and a radically different philosophy. Japanese doctrine valued artisanal perfection. Each destroyer was a work of art forged in months of labor, a symbol of national honor. America, on the other hand, embraced mass production. Where Japan saw honor in the individual ship, the United States saw victory on the assembly line. The steel giants, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were kings of the open seas, but proved slow, expensive, and ill-suited for the naval guerrilla war unfolding in the Pacific's island labyrinths. Something lighter, faster, cheaper, and above all expendable was needed. A weapon capable of fighting in shallow waters among reefs and sandbars and vanishing into the darkness before retaliation could even be calculated. It was in this strategic vacuum that engineers from Higgins Industries in New Orleans and the Elco Naval Division in New Jersey waged their own industrial duel to create a legend. Elco, more traditional, based its designs on proven British models. Higgins, led by the charismatic and stubborn Andrew Higgins, brought the brutal practicality of a man who built boats for Louisiana's bayous. The result of their competition was an 80-foot, about 24-meter boat that, at first glance, looked more like a luxury speedboat. But on its deck, it carried 4 torpedoes and an arsenal of machine guns. Crewed by just 12 men, it was christened the Patrol Torpedo Boat, or simply PT Boat. If you opened its hull, you would see the improbable. Layers of Philippine mahogany, Alaskan cedar, and American oak, joined by waterproof glue and thousands of copper rivets. The wooden architecture was not designed to withstand impacts, but to float over them, twisting and flexing with the waves like muscles in motion. It was a design for speed, not strength. The contradiction was its essence, a warboat that survived only if it was too fast to be hit. The first missions, however, were a resounding disaster. Crews returned frustrated and, at times, terrified. The Mark 8 torpedoes, an obsolete inheritance from World War I, were a deadly joke. They ran too deep, passing harmlessly under targets. Their magnetic detonators were so faulty that they often exploded prematurely or, worse, failed to detonate on impact, turning bold attacks into spectacles of impotence. The wooden hulls, though agile, splintered easily against armored destroyers. The project quickly earned a grim nickname among sailors, wooden coffins. It seemed the bet on speed had failed. The turnaround came not from the sea but from a luxury car factory in Detroit. The Packard Motor Company, famed for its sophisticated automobiles, adapted its V-12 aircraft engine for naval use. The result was the Packard 4M 2500, a 2,500 cubic inch monster that on its own generated 1,350 horsepower. With 3 of these engines side by side in the cramped, stifling hold of a PT boat, the total power exceeded 4,000 horsepower. The noise was deafening, the heat unbearable, and the fuel consumption absurd, burning nearly 2,000 liters of high-octane aviation gasoline per hour at full throttle. But the result was magical. When the 3 engines roared in unison, the hull designed to plane lifted out of the water, skimming the surface at over 40 knots, about 75 kilometers per hour, a speed that left any Japanese destroyer behind. Physics had finally become its shield. But speed alone was not enough. The genius of the PT boat lay not just in its construction, but in the culture of improvisation it inspired. In makeshift bases on islands like Tulagi, in workshops set up under tents, grease and sweat-covered mechanics and crewmen reinvented their own war. Led by figures like Robert Kelly, nicknamed Torpedo Kelly, they disassembled detonators, cleaned springs, adjusted gyroscopes, and with hand tools reprogrammed ammunition. Every failure yielded a lesson, every mission a new tweak. Doctrine was born not from manuals, but from survival. The boat became a floating laboratory, and that capacity for adaptation, that courage to rewrite the rules in real time, would be its deadliest weapon. The early morning of August 2, 1943 began like so many others in the Solomon Islands, heavy, hot, and wrapped in a silence that existed only to be shattered by explosions. The PT-109, under the command of a young, lanky lieutenant named John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was gliding at reduced speed through Blackett Strait. The 26-year-old officer, heir to one of America's most powerful families, was just another commander trying to survive the night, part of a larger and poorly coordinated patrol. Just after 2 a.m., fate revealed itself in the form of a gigantic shadow that emerged from the darkness without warning. The Japanese destroyer Amagiri, returning from a supply mission and advancing at 30 knots, did not see the small boat ahead until it was too late. The impact was instantaneous and brutal. The Amagiri's steel hull tore the PT-109 in two like a blade slicing a matchstick. The explosion of the fuel tanks lit the night with a white-yellow flash. 2 crewmen died on impact. Kennedy was thrown against the deck, seriously injuring his back. The Japanese destroyer, without even stopping, continued on its way. What followed was not a tale of tactical victory, but a saga of survival that would become legend. Injured, Kennedy gathered his 10 survivors and, tying the strap of his badly burned gunner's life jacket between his teeth, swam for miles through shark-infested waters to a small deserted island, towing the wounded man. The story of the PT-109 became a symbol of leadership, but in tactical terms, it was a failure that highlighted the boat's vulnerability. The true turning point, the night that proved the mosquitoes could kill giants, had happened months earlier. That night was December 12, 1942, off Guadalcanal. The Japanese destroyer IJN Teruzuki, a new and powerful vessel, was on a supply mission. To the crews of PT boats PT-37 and PT-40 patrolling the area, it was the epitome of a steel giant. In a daring maneuver, the small wooden boats approached stealthily in the darkness. They launched their torpedoes, now modified by field ingenuity. One struck the Teruzuki full-on. The initial impact did not sink the ship, but it sparked a fire and, crucially, detonated the destroyer's own depth charges carried on board. The secondary explosion was cataclysmic. The Teruzuki was broken in half and sank, taking part of its crew with it. The Japanese High Command was in a state of shock. For the first time, a wooden boat, considered a mere nuisance, had destroyed a modern, fully armed destroyer. The psychological barrier had been broken. The men of the PT boats lived on the edge, calling their boats floating gasoline barrels. Temperatures in the engine rooms exceeded 50 degrees. The noise was so intense that crewmen communicated by gestures. When the alarm sounded, "Visual contact," everything boiled down to seconds, and yet they pressed on. From that December night, every Japanese captain in the Solomon Islands knew the real danger came not just from planes or submarines, but from the silent, swift PT boats. Fear had become a weapon. If you enjoy real WW2 stories told without sensationalism, subscribe. Here we go back to the nights when wood and courage changed the Pacific. The mosquitoes had learned to bite, and their bite was deadly. In the fall of 1943, the lights of the Navy Ministry in Tokyo burned until dawn. In rooms where the conquest of half the globe had once been planned, tense-faced officers now pored over reports telling a story of collapse. What had once been the empire's pride, the Tokyo Express, had now become a trail of death. The doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle that had guided the Imperial Navy for decades, now sounded like a bitter joke. Japan dreamed of a war of heroes and battleships. The enemy waged a war of logistics, mathematics, and patience. Every American boat lost was replaced. They cost only a fraction of a destroyer's price and were produced at an assembly line pace, with weekly deliveries and continuous batches. Every Japanese destroyer sunk, on the other hand, was an industrial and moral amputation from which the empire could not recover. Steel was scarce, shipyards slow. Admiral Genichi Mikawa, a national hero, confessed in his diary, "The enemy is small but seems infinite. It strikes where there is no sound and destroys more than steel. It destroys confidence." It was the acknowledgement that the war had changed and they were losing. The most devastating impact was not the loss of warships, but the logistical strangulation. The PT boat's greatest offensive capability revealed itself not against destroyers, but against landing barges and small transport ships that formed the true lifeblood of the Japanese army. Routes to isolated garrisons became a game of Russian roulette. The Tokyo Express, which had once used fast destroyers, now relied on slower, more vulnerable vessels, easier targets for nocturnal attacks. A significant portion of convoys never reached their final destination, and rising losses made the route unpredictable and deadly. On islands like Guadalcanal and Kolombangara, Japanese garrisons began to rot alive. Soldiers' reports describe a tropical hell where hunger, malaria, and despair became deadlier enemies than American bullets. Men who had landed with the spirit of Bushido now hunted rats, lizards, and boiled leaves to survive. Samurai pride crumbled under the weight of starvation and isolation. The collapse was not just tactical, it was emotional. Fear had become a strategic weapon, corroding the Japanese war machine from within. On the other side, American industrial logic was relentless and almost cruel in its efficiency. The math was simple and brutal. The United States could afford to lose mass-produced boats. Japan could not lose its precious, irreplaceable destroyers. The war was no longer about honor, but about iteration and production. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had warned before his death in April 1943, "I can guarantee 6 months of victories. After that, nothing." He knew Japan could not compete with the war's true invisible battleship, American industry. When the Empire tried to respond, it was too late. They developed the Shinyo, small wooden suicide boats loaded with explosives, a desperate attempt to imitate PT boat tactics. But the Shinyo were not strategic weapons, they were weapons of despair. Slow, short-ranged, and tactically inflexible, they were the final confession that Japan had lost not just the sea, but the very logic of war. The philosophy of improvisation, adaptation, and mass production had defeated the mystique of honor and artisanal perfection. When the fires of World War II finally died, and Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender, the Pacific Ocean turned blue again. The waves that had once hidden wreckage and bodies now seemed tranquil, but beneath that calm surface lay the skeletons of an era. On the seafloor around the Solomon Islands, in the place known as Iron Bottom Sound, rested broken battleships, charred destroyers, and freighters that never completed their routes. But amid those steel ruins, there were almost no wooden hulls. The PT boats, too light to sink cleanly and too fragile to endure, vanished almost without a trace. Deemed war surplus, most met an inglorious end. They were simply dragged onto Philippine beaches and burned in massive pyres, as if time wanted to erase the memory that for a brief moment the power of the world belonged to the small. And yet their echo remained, not on the ocean floor, but in military thought, culture, and the souls of the men who survived that war of ghosts. Naval historians who analyzed the Solomon Islands campaign soon noticed something extraordinary. In terms of total tonnage sunk, the PT boats were statistically insignificant compared to submarines and aircraft carriers. Their torpedoes, even after modifications, remained problematic. But the metric of victory was never in the spreadsheets. The true impact lay in psychology and adaptation. The Mosquitoes had changed enemy behavior, forced route alterations, delayed vital convoys, and eroded Imperial Navy confidence. They proved that modern war is not decided solely by what you destroy, but by what you make the enemy fear. It was the first time a minuscule naval force used agility, stealth, and surprise as strategic weapons, a concept that would define conflicts throughout the 20th century. In the years that followed, navies around the world studied the wooden boat phenomenon. The idea of fast attack craft, fast attack boats, small ships armed with powerful missiles, was born directly from the PT boat's DNA. The term area denial, now fundamental to naval strategy, was forged in those dark straits when 24-meter boats challenged and paralyzed 120-meter destroyers. They taught the world a new grammar of war, not victory by mass, but by motion. But the legacy of the PT boats is not just technical, it is deeply human. The men who crewed them, many young college students or mechanics, formed a unique brotherhood, forged in the heat of engines and the fear of the night. Among them was John F. Kennedy, who turned his shipwreck into a symbol of resilience and leadership that propelled him to the White House. Decades later, as president, he kept on his Oval Office desk a coconut wrapped in plastic, the same one in which he carved his distress message. It was a constant reminder of the lesson learned in the Solomons, that courage is made of something steel does not possess. Today, at Battleship Cove Museum in Fall River, Massachusetts, rests the PT-617, one of the few surviving examples. Visitors are surprised by its size, too small for the myth it carries. But there, on its narrow deck, one can grasp the paradox. These fragile, ephemeral boats represented a philosophical victory that still echoes. In every unmanned drone, every stealth ship, every light and agile attack system, there is a spark of the wooden boat's spirit. They proved that the future belongs not to those who build the biggest ship, but to those who think the sea differently. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson of all.
If you want to keep sailing through real battles like this one, subscribe and turn on notifications. Sometimes it's the smallest boats that make the biggest waves.